Well, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Rethinking Christianity. On today's episode, I have author Brian McLaren, who has a new title coming out May 24th, Do I Stay Christian? Super excited to talk with Brian about this book. I think that it is a very helpful resource for you as listeners. So, Brian, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me today.
Well, thanks for having me, Blake.
Yeah, for sure. So what drew you to the title, Do I Stay Christian? I think this is a very relevant title and a question that a lot of people are asking themselves.
Yeah, I'm going to guess that anyone who would have a podcast called Rethinking Christianity would understand.
Yes.
I think a whole lot of us who grew up in the Christian faith, it's something we inherited. And in a sense, you are in it unless you opt out. There are a lot of people who are opting out at various points in their life for various reasons. And then other people are not brought up Christians, but they have a conversion experience and they come to Christian faith. And then they feel like, hold it, this thing is going in directions I didn't plan on, and this doesn't seem quite right. So I think this is something like a pandemic that's spreading across major parts of the Christian community. Add to that scandals that we've heard all about. People have these wonderful experiences in churches and then things go sour. And you put all that together. A few years ago, the statistic was 65 million adults in America grew up in church-going homes, Christian homes, and as adults, they have left. That's a lot of people, and it grows by 2.7 or so million people a year. So there are a lot of people who are rethinking Christianity and wondering if they should stay Christian.
Yeah, so I started this, this podcast with that title, and like it's an interesting thing to kind of approach because at times it feels like you're the only one. It's like everyone around me. But what I came to find out is, no, I wasn't the only one. That actually a lot of people my age were asking these questions and wondering these same things. And so I would definitely agree with what you just said, that it is kind of like a pandemic, and people have different names for it, the deconstruction movement and things like that. But I think it's deeper than just that. And I think there's a lot more to it. And that's why I think this title, it's very compelling. The question, do I stay Christian? I really love how you have divided the book. I found it really interesting that you start off with the answer no, and then you kind of have these chapters that explain maybe why you wouldn't, and then there's some chapters of yes, and then you kind of talk through how to go about that if you do decide to stay. I'd love to hear. So how did you come to the conclusion of this is how I want to divide the book and like write the book into this way? Because I think what it does for people that read it is it shows that you're kind of laying it all out there. There's not this like bias, I think, that comes a lot of times with people that, are trying to convince people to stay Christian. But yeah, how did you kind of come up with that approach?
Well, there was this whole field called apologetics when I was growing up that was really big. It's still out there, but it was really big when I was growing up. And the way the average apologetics book worked is it said, here's an issue, here's a question. And it might give a paragraph or two taking the question seriously. And then it would dismiss the question and say, it's not a real question, or here's a good answer to it. And it's sort of the idea being, so you have no choice, you have to stay a Christian. And, or if you don't, you're not honest. Or in other words, it felt like a bait and switch. We're not really going to take your questions that seriously. And it's a foregone conclusion from the beginning that you'd better stay Christian. And I suppose behind that is kind of the threat, or really bad things are going to happen to you in this life and beyond. Look, that way of thinking is a huge part of what's driving many people away from the faith. They're thinking, I'm a parent, I have little children. It's not how I would treat my children. Why would God treat us that way? So, and also I think we're becoming more and more suspicious, especially as reports of scandals and abuses of power among religious leaders. We're becoming more and more suspicious, and rightfully so, of religious leaders who are going to kind of push us into a corner. So I felt it was my responsibility to take people's questions really, really seriously. And I was a pastor for 24 years. I had so many people come to me with deep questions about the faith and wondering if they could stay Christian. I work primarily with clergy now. As a former pastor myself, I face struggles with my Christian identity. So many clergy come to me with this. So I just think this is not the time to dismiss questions and jump to conclusions. I think we have to take the questions and objections really, really seriously. And I also would add that I think there are people who will not stay Christian, and they have good reasons for making that choice. And look, if I can use an example that I think we can imagine, I think about a friend of mine who was abused, a Catholic friend who was abused by a priest at a young age. He grows up, goes to Catholic school, Catholic high school, Catholic college, is abused again. And after the second time, it was like, I'm just done. I gave the church a second chance, and look what happened to me. And so I think we have to look at people who have been really wounded and really traumatized. There are so many women who have stories that they're keeping a secret because a youth minister or a pastor abused usually it's his, sometimes maybe it's her, but usually his power. And yeah, that pain is real. So we got to take it seriously. Sorry to ramble on, but
no.
It's a great question.
I think you make a lot of really important points. I mean, Jesus himself, he was against, like at the time period that he was in, Judaism and the way in which the message that he was opposed to was this, like, cornering people into, this is how it's got to be. I mean, he continually says, you've heard it said this way, but I say this. And when we emulate Jesus, a lot of times it looks more like an evolving faith rather than just like, I'm stuck in this way. Yeah. And I think what your book does as well is, I think that when you deal with those really hard things and negative things, it gives people permission to be like, okay, I can ask questions and I can wonder. And I think that's really, really helpful.
Well, I suppose, like, you're bringing to the surface one of the other reasons I wrote the book in this form and started with no, because those of us who are going to stay Christian, I think we have a kind of moral obligation to face the dark sides of our history.
Yeah.
A lot of people are still, in fact, we see it in our country, even in politics. People don't want us to face some of the ugly truths about our history, and they're trying to get things out of textbooks and schools. And the same thing happens in religious communities. But if we're going to stay Christian, I think we need to have our eyes wide open and face those realities about our past. Otherwise, we could very easily repeat them or even exceed the wrongs that have been done in the past. And as you say, as you were talking, I was thinking about Jesus, that story of Jesus and the rich young ruler. And the rich young ruler comes and they have a conversation, and then he decides, okay, I'm not in anymore. Yeah. And Jesus doesn't yell at him and say, if you walk away, you're gonna, pay. He respects the man's dignity and respects the man's freedom. And it says he loved him and watched him leave, Yeah. And I think that's something we need to learn how to emulate.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with you there. I think it all is just it's a thing that people are wrestling with and dealing with. And I think it's just, the more we allow people to engage with it, I think something that you mentioned was the apologetics and I experienced that growing up. I grew up in Southern Baptist Church, and that was part of the kind of thing. And I remember there was, I was helping at this church, and I would serve pretty regularly. I remember on a senior Sunday, you recognize your graduates and things like that. And they had a resource for the students that were leaving off to college or whatever. The boogeyman was, can you keep your faith in college, kind of thing. And when I think back on that, it was just so interesting to me, because it's like, I don't think that allows people to have open dialogue and conversation. And then secondly, what I always found was that the arguments to support were not even the arguments that people were using in universities and things like that. And I think that part of it is when we keep, ourselves in boxes, so to speak. When we first engage with something that really makes us question, there's like this shock value to it.
Yes.
That is like, oh, I've never really thought about it like that before. And we don't know what to do with it because we're not having these open dialogues. And I think that for me, I did an undergrad in like Christian studies. And one of the classes I took was a hard study of the academics of the Bible. And when I began to engage with that, I was like, I don't know what to do with this. And thankfully I've, come across some resources that have really helped me in that. But I think that the big thing is the dialogue piece, being able to have those open conversations.
This might still be true. I don't know, but years ago, I know this was true. There was a very famous seminary where in order to be accepted in, you had to sign a doctrinal statement. And then when you graduated, in order to get your degree, you had to sign exactly the same doctrinal statement. And I always thought they ought to put on the website, we guarantee that you will learn nothing new.
That's insane.
in your years coming here.
Yeah.
We won't change your mind on anything. We'll just tell you what you already think.
Yeah, I know that there's some places where you have to, I know the college I went to, you have to sign a lifestyle agreement essentially, and all the things that you support within that denomination. But yeah, that's definitely still things going on. That's one of the reasons people don't want anything to do with Christianity. Was there a particular chapter that you found like that you really enjoyed writing the most, if you have one or two?
Yeah. Well, this book was really a joy for me to write, even though it was difficult. Those first 10 chapters where I talk about the no, those are hard to write. And I knew that that many readers would find them really disturbing. And the book, it hasn't officially released as we're having this conversation, but I've been told by people who've read advanced copies that, there were some chapters that they had to put down. One fellow told me when he read the chapter about Christian on Christian violence, it's chapter 2. And then he went back and read the appendix where I put stuff in that I didn't feel a lot of readers could handle, so I said, look, it's kind of like a trigger warning. So I'm not saying all of it was much of it was difficult, but it was things that I felt really needed to be said. But there were a few chapters where I felt like, oh, that's what I've been trying to say for the last 15 years, One of them was the chapter about toxic theology. And I think I called it Because Christianity is Stuck. And I was able to talk about, actually, and then in another chapter, I talked about constricted intellectualism. And I felt like I finally got to articulate what it was. It wasn't just anti-intellectualism. There's certainly a lot of that, but it was a different kind of intellectualism, really, that I just mentioned in that anecdote about the seminary, where you invest a huge amount of intellectual energy to be sure you don't have any new thoughts. And you fight everything that's different from what you already think. That's called confirmation bias. So it becomes intellect in service of confirmation bias. And then there was a chapter in the second part where in the third part where I got to talk about the importance of nature and the outdoors. And I feel that if we take seriously the idea of God as creator, we have to take far more seriously what reality is trying to tell us. And so those would be a couple of the chapters that especially stood out. There's chapters in part 2 where I talk about something I call the cult of innocence and addiction to innocence. And that also was something that I think I've been feeling, but wasn't ever able to put into words until this book.
Yeah. Was there any like moments, like I guess before, and maybe you'd been mulling on this idea for a long time, and I can think of things that I've just observed in culture and church or whatever, but were there any moments that you can think to in your life, or maybe just you've experienced or you've observed, where you were kind of to the point of like, yeah, this is a resource, this is something that needs to be written about, this is something that we have to talk about?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Blake. And that's happened for me maybe in 2 different ways. When I first started writing, I've written 20 some books now. I never planned on writing 20 books. I had one book I wanted to write, But what happened is when I would go out and speak about that book, I'd get invitations to speak based on the book. People would come up to me with questions and I would think, that's a good question. I didn't answer that. And my first book raises that question. That's what I got to write about next. So it's felt a little bit like a train, like each book opened up the questions that the next book needed to raise. This book really comes out of so many people telling me, I don't know how much longer I can hang on, or telling me I'm done, I'm through. Or the number of people who describe themselves as ex-Christian or ex-evangelical. And I love many of these. I love all these people, and I take very seriously their pain. And so, those conversations really contributed to actually this book and the book that I wrote right before this called Faith After Doubt. And when I wrote Faith After Doubt, I was writing it with this book in mind. And when I wrote this book, it really was flowing from Faith After Doubt. So these two really kind of were born together.
I have that one as well. So they're at Faith After Doubt's also, if you're a listener and you're looking for another book, so you could read Faith After Doubt and then get on the 24th, get Do I Stay Christian? So I think both of those are very, very helpful. I think of like a lot of different kind of moments in my life. The first one, really being in college when I began to ask questions about like, well, why do I believe this? Like what's my reasoning for that? When have you had, I guess, that moment in your life where you've had to ask the question that this book raises, am I going to stay Christian? And what was that experience like for you?
So for me, there have been probably literally thousands of those moments. But the first one came very early. I grew up, in a very conservative family, but I was really interested in science. I still am. I love to read about science. And I thought that evolution made a lot of sense. I thought it was pretty obvious that the earth was 14 billion years old, the way that the scientists said, and not 6,000 years old, the way that they taught me at church. And so I remember at a very young age thinking, when I'm 18, I'm out of here. I still want to be a good person, but I don't think this religion has room for me. Then in my teenage years, I had a very powerful spiritual experience where I just felt really deeply connected with Jesus. And so and then I became a pastor. But even as a pastor, I had many moments where like I remember one morning I ran into the bathroom before I was about to preach, and I looked in the mirror and I looked at myself. I thought, I don't know if I believe in God anymore. And so, those moments where you wonder, I'm not sure I can stay Christian anymore. There have been a lot of those moments. And then there have been so many moments where Christians say and do things that I find so repulsive and so harmful and so dangerous and embarrassing and shameful, and that I just think, I don't want to lend my name to this project. So there are all different ways that question's come up for me. Have you had some of those experiences too?
Yeah. I mean, on all the topics that, from what you mentioned, like even when I was young, I was like, so my mom would read me this chronological Bible. And it was cool. It tried to emulate the chronology of like, how it all worked. And they would explain that the ages of the people in the Old Testament and match it up with, well, this tells us how long the world has been existent and all of these things. And even then, like as I started to get older, maybe like 12, 13, I was like, I don't know. And I always had these questions in the back of my mind of like, age of the earth, evolution, things like that. Because my thing was, I just felt like you mentioned earlier, a lot of times there's a lot of use of confirmation bias and like just ignoring the things that are in front of us. And one of the things that I always found interesting, and I would ask people this, is one of the things that in apologetics, for instance, within Christianity, is you have apologetics towards other religions. And we would use, Christians would use strategies to disprove another religion's book or whatever.
Yes.
But if that strategy was used to disprove, so to speak, not saying that it does, the Bible or the history of Christianity or whatever, that strategy is not allowed to use. And so there was these things that I observed, and I was like, I don't get this. And this kind of goes into the next question I kind of wanted to ask. For me, what I have found is that, and I mentioned that idea of like shock value. There's this like kind of shock when you come to grips with your questioning, is that what I began to observe is my issues weren't necessarily with like the Christian faith in Jesus, like who Jesus was, the way of life that he presents, the things that he calls us to do and be. My issues weren't with that. My issues were with how things were defined for me.
Yes.
And what it looked like for me in my life to have an evolving faith.
Yes.
And I really struggled with that. Do you feel like that's something that's very true for people, that it may not be issues with Jesus? And I'd love to talk about Jesus in a second, but have you found for many people there's a real struggle with this tension of like evolving faith and abandoning faith?
Yes. So someplace in the book, I make this comment that there's this underlying assumption that's shared by probably a vast majority of traditional Christians. And the assumption is that Christianity was revealed by God, that all the information is there in the New Testament. We combine that information and we create a systematic theology, and that theology is perfect.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with it. There's no flaws in it. There's nothing missing from it. It's everything that we need that's available to us. And so what I said later in the book is that version of Christianity is either perfect or has to pretend to be perfect, because it's not allowed to admit that we probably have a lot of things wrong and we've got a lot of room to grow. And our ancestors, we know they were wrong about some things, but we have to pretend as if we've got it all right now. Yeah. And what's so ironic about this is, like, there's a passage in the Gospel of John where Jesus says, hey, guys, there's a lot more I'd like to tell you. You're just not ready for it yet. The Spirit will guide you, as time goes on. Of course, I know what some people will say. Yes, the Spirit guided Paul and he answered all those questions. So now there's nothing more you need to learn, right? But I think the Bible itself gives us an example of an evolving faith. And in fact, I even think we could talk about this if you want. There's a couple of fascinating examples in the Gospels where Jesus, I think, models an evolving faith. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's very much what we need. And in some ways, the yes part of this book is saying it's one of the ways it's possible to say, yes, I'm going to stay Christian, is by acknowledging that this faith is an evolving faith and that we're allowed to learn from our mistakes and say, we have been wrong about so much, and we're humbled by that. And we want to keep learning and growing.
Yeah, I'd love to hear some of the observations that you have on Jesus
well, there are two times in the Gospels where Jesus changes his mind, and they both involve women, interestingly. One is in John 2, when Jesus' mother comes to him. They're at a wedding, and she says, hey, they're out of wine. And Jesus, it sounds a little bit cheeky, he says, what does this have to do with me, woman? Or something like that, I never talked to my mom that way, right? And then she walks to the people nearby and says, hey, whatever he tells you, do it. As if to say, I know he's going to do what I want him to do.
Yeah.
Great. And he ends up doing it.
Yeah.
I think Jesus says, my time has not yet come. And it's almost as if in her coming to him and saying that, he realizes, oh, yes, my time has come.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that shows Jesus having a realization as things unfold. An even more powerful example, you find it in a couple of the Gospels, but I believe it's Matthew 15. I may be wrong on the chapter number at the moment, but it's the story of Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, or the Canaanite woman, as she's called by Matthew. And this woman who's not a Jew comes to Jesus asking for help, and he keeps turning her away. using language that's impossible to make not look prejudiced. And then she is persistent and she has great answers to his rebuffs. And then he says, woman, you have great faith, and what you need will happen. And it's as if Matthew has the courage to show us that Jesus reaches a moment where he says, I wasn't ready to help a Gentile, but now I've seen and learned something from this woman. And now I see that's the right thing to do. Now, I know some people will be very upset to talk about Jesus like he could learn anything, but Luke tells us that Jesus, when he was a young adult, grew in wisdom and stature. So I don't think the gospel writers are as embarrassed to talk about Jesus having an evolving faith as much as as many of us today might be.
Yeah, and that's funny you mentioned, like, so I did an interview with Pete Enns a while back, and he mentioned the statement. We were talking about the idea of like the historicity of the Bible and things like that. And I talked about the argument, well, Jesus quotes some of these passages from the Old Testament. Does that mean Jesus was wrong about in that whole thing? And he proposed a question. He was like, well, is being wrong sinful? And I was like, oh, I never thought about that. And so I think that's interesting. With the Gentile woman, that's a really interesting example. I think you see Jesus is continually challenging, like just the status quo, even the story of the Good Samaritan. For those disciples to hear that story probably was like, there's no way that this Samaritan could be someone that helps. And we see that the Gospels really present a challenge for, I think what makes it so beautiful is this transcendent challenge to just humanity in general. So for you, what about Jesus is compelling to you in the midst of like that evolving tension, that like at the root of it, you can come back to him?
In one of my earlier books, like I said something that was a little bit snide, but I said, in my upbringing, we accepted Jesus as our savior, but Paul was our Lord and teacher. and what I meant by that is we often said Jesus was born to die. Jesus says, I was born to teach. He says that I came in this world, to preach this gospel. But what I realized is and in fact, we even see this in many of the traditional creeds. We get Jesus born, and then right away we usher him off to die and then rise again. We skip over his whole life and everything he said and did. And what really has captivated me is what Jesus said and did, his life, his teaching. And what's made that even more interesting is when I don't put Jesus in the context of contemporary theological debate, but I let Jesus be in his native environment in first century Israel under the occupation of the Romans, and in a deeply conflicted Jewish community where he's trying to figure out what's a way through, where there are religious extremists, just as we have today, who are thinking about overthrowing the government and starting a war, which we have, sad to say, going on here, even in our country today. And when I put Jesus in that context, I know this is not in any of the creeds, but this is my honest feeling. I feel like I fall on my knees and I say, he is brilliant. He is right. He is wise. I feel this again and again and again. And it's just, I'm awestruck. This just happened to me in the last couple of weeks. I reread the Beatitudes, and I just think the wisdom and the brilliance and the sophistication that's contained in those Beatitudes, it's breathtaking, So that, I'm honestly in awe. And I often have wondered if I could stay Christian, in the sense of being affiliated with this or that version of the Christian religion. But, I've never woken up one day and said, yeah, Jesus just isn't that great. That thought has never come to my mind. I've had questions about the doctrines that people articulate about Jesus, but just in terms of what a compelling human being. That never
Yes.
leaves me
Yes.
for a second.
Yeah. I've heard like recently the statement of we love the truth of Jesus, but not the way of Jesus. And that idea of like we're Christians for the most part are okay with the idea of like in the traditional format that it's presented, like you accept Jesus as Savior, you die, and then you go to heaven. Well, the between doesn't really, it's
Yeah.
whatever. As long as you kind of don't cuss, don't drink, don't do all the traditional
Yes.
things that are wrong. Yeah. So yeah, I really, there's an author that I've read some, Mark Scandrette. He has some
Yes.
really good stuff on just like
He
what it looks
does.
like to bring like spiritual formation into your life and emulating what Jesus presents. Well, you mentioned about the Beatitudes. He has a really great
Oh my,
resource, the Ninefold
Ma-
Path.
Mark is a dear friend, and I think he's so right. Jesus doesn't say, you don't find this in the Bible. A man a teacher of the law came to Jesus and said, "What is the great commandment?" And Jesus said, "Thou shalt have the correct doctrines about me and affirm the five fundamentals of the faith about me." And is that what he says? He says it's about love God, love your neighbors, you love yourself, and it's a way of life. It's not a system of beliefs. And that to me is another thing to love about Jesus that puts a lot of people in conflict with the Christian religion. Um, but again, I'm not trying to say Jesus is great and the Christian religion is horrible. I just want to say Jesus is great and the Christian religion is still figuring out about how great Jesus is and how to actually be faithful. The Christian religion is figuring that out. I'm figuring that out. I think we all are.
Yeah, and like you said, it's a continuing, evolving thing,
Yes.
evolving faith. So when people come in and they get, do I stay Christian? What is your hope that readers can take from it as they read, as they think through it? Maybe have like what you mentioned earlier. You've had readers have to put it down. What is your hope in that?
Yeah. Well, um, I suppose one's greatest hope is that the reading of the book creates a space where they can get in touch with what's going on in them that they need to get in touch with. Uh, uh, and it's funny. I've been writing for a long time. I love to write. I love to read, and it's been just hitting me recently that, in a sense, when I pick up a book, I'm saying to an author, I'm going to give you permission to be inside my head for 12 hours, if that's how long it takes me to read the book. I'm going to give you a chance to actually be inside my head, and I'm going to follow your line of thinking. But the purpose of that isn't so I'll think like you. The purpose of that is I want to see what you can do to stimulate my own thinking. And that's my hope. My hope is it will help people to face things they need to face and make decisions they need to make and clarify things they need to clarify. If that can happen, I'll be super happy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that will be able to be done. I think that it is a resource that provides all those things and does all those things. What are some resources as well? I know we have we mentioned Faith After Doubt, and you have a lot of books that you've written. Who are some people that maybe have provided value for you as you're working through these questions, and just kind of like maybe helped you in I guess your evolving faith, so to speak, that you feel like
Yeah.
listeners could find as valuable?
Well, there are so many, but maybe I can create a category that I think is important. I'm 66 years old, so I was born in the 1950s, which is sure a long time ago now. And I reached a point, I can't remember which book, it was my third or fourth book. And somebody made a comment to me. They said, I looked at your footnotes and your bibliography. Well, I actually don't have bibliographies in my books, but I looked at your footnotes in the books that you cite. And almost everybody is a white male.
Mm.
And part of that is because I come from a sector of Christianity where white males make all the rules. And even if I didn't agree with that, I felt I had to quote white males to get credibility in that, in the rules of that game. And I realized, first, I haven't read enough books by women theologians, and I haven't read enough books by people of color. And so that brought about a change. And in recent years, oh my goodness, what I have gained from reading the writings of non-white males. Not that there are no great, good writers who are white males out there too, but just as an example, I came across a book by an African theologian named Kwame Bediako called Christianity and Identity. And this, obviously, a book like Do I Stay Christian is a book about Christian identity. And I think I paid $50 or $80 for this book because it's not easily available. Scholarly book. I read that book and I thought, I don't know if I've ever encountered as brilliant a mind as this fellow who I had never heard of, and I wouldn't have read his book except I was interested in the subject of theology and identity. Oh my gosh, I'm still in awe. And I think Kwame Bediako, he was a Presbyterian, I believe, but I think he spoke 7 languages. He was fluent in 7 languages.
My gosh.
Just amazing. And then I, some years ago, began reading the Latin American liberation theologians like John Sobrino and Leonardo Boff, who's written one of the books that touched me most deeply of any book I've ever read, called Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor. And then I grew up Catholic. So when I started reading, I grew up Protestant. So when I started reading Catholic theologians, it was like a new world. I remember the first time I read a book by Sister Joan Chittister.
Yes, I had her on. Changed my life. Yeah.
And she just brought me so much wisdom and insight, so the list goes on and on and on. I'll tell you, as someone who grew up in a conservative background that took the Bible very seriously, although we hardly ever actually read what was there, we read what we needed to find to be there.
Yeah.
When I read one of Dr. Will Gaffney's books called Womanist Midrash, I felt I was in the presence of someone who is seeing things in the Bible and helping me see they were so obviously there that I felt like I'd been trained my whole life not to see, So yeah, so many great writers like that.
Yeah. I had a professor that really challenged me, and that's where all this journey started. And I'm at the time I was like, I would go and ask him questions. He wouldn't give me the answers. He would let me deal with it, and that's what I needed at the time. I'm pretty sure he had introduced me to Pete Enns and his work. Yes. And I read Inspiration and Incarnation. And that book, I was like, okay, now this is just open. It's like a hallway of doors, and you just keep opening doors, and it's like you're seeing what's behind each one. I think that, that podcast is the Bible for Normal People. Really,
what a treasure. I love Pete and Jared. What a great thing they do.
Yeah. And I started reading a lot of like works like your work, A New Kind of Christian. I think that's just a really great presentation of a different way of thinking things. And during the same time period, I read Velvet Elvis by Rob Bell, and I still think that book is really, really good. It
really is good.
I suggest that to anyone that's just beginning to like kind of think through things, and I think it does a really, really good job. Brian, I really appreciate you coming on Rethinking Christianity and kind of talking with me about this book. I want to encourage listeners that if you haven't read any of Brian's works, go find them, go buy them. We have Do I Stay Christian coming out on May 24th. Definitely get that. You can find it on Amazon. I'll post the link in the show notes and in the caption on YouTube. We're super excited for this book to come out and see the impact that it'll have on people. I know that it'll be a blessing to a lot of people. So thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any last words for any listeners that anything you'd love to leave them with?
Well, can I just say, I'm so glad to meet you, Blake. And I'm so glad when you tell that story about having a professor who didn't tell you what to think, but gave you freedom and permission to think. Yeah. That's what it's all about. And that's what you're doing through this podcast. And I'm honored to be part of that good work. Because I think, one of my mentors said to me, learning is not a consequence of teaching. Learning is a consequence of thinking.
That's good.
And, Jesus, one of his great, often repeated words was repent. And repent means think again. Have a second thought about that. And think for yourself about this. Don't just keep going in what you've always thought. And so it's an honor to be on this journey with you.
Awesome. Thanks again so much for coming on. Again, listeners, Do I Stay Christian coming out May 24th. Until next time, this is Blake and Rethinking Christianity.